welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series, where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian. This week is a little bit different. We have somewhat of a special edition focused entirely on the Sydney siege. This is because that pretty much dominated all of the news here in Western Australia for much of the week. And so I thought I'd devote this entire video to issues in and around the Sydney siege. So first up, taken off air, 17th of December 2014. The media did the wrong thing by giving the gunman such blanket coverage which effectively gave him what he wanted, a platform to deliver whatever warped idealism he was trying to promote. If an incident such as this ever takes place again, the assailant's main opportunity for self-promotion should be removed. Grant Athau, Dalyellup. Okay, so you kind of missed the point that you even were making yourself in the letter here, is that you didn't know what the hell his point was, and part of the reason you didn't know was because the media did not promote him. In fact, one of his main demands throughout the siege, for the 17 hours he was in there, was that he wanted to contact the news media because he had several demands that he wanted. And acting on the advice of the police, the news media, including the television stations and radio stations, all refused to give him any airtime. So while they did broadcast, in great detail, the siege from an outsider's perspective, they gave no airtime whatsoever to the guy inside. Exactly as you're suggesting, partly because they didn't want to give him any self-promotion opportunities, but also because the police wanted to ensure that he communicated with them through their negotiators and didn't want to give him an audience elsewhere. And the fact that, as you say, you didn't actually know what his point was, is a good indication that that actually worked. He even got so frustrated he made his hostages post on Facebook and on YouTube videos and messages of his demands in an attempt to get media coverage. And again, the media refused to pick up and run with that during the siege. So the media actually did a much more responsible job of broadcasting this than perhaps in other occasions where they refused to get caught up in that. Next up, shoot on sight, 17th of December 2014. We should heap praise on the New South Wales Police for dealing with this incident so professionally. But if it was me or a relative or friend in the Lind Cafe, I would have supported the shooting of the perpetrator by a trained sniper at the earliest opportunity. These types of criminals do not deserve negotiation and should be eliminated without fanfare, so that a message is sent to anyone wishing to engage in such activities, that they will suffer the ultimate consequences of their actions. Doug Meal, Quinn's Rocks. Okay, so here we don't have the death penalty, and part of the reason why we don't have the death penalty is we recognise that, well, there's many reasons, but part of that is we recognise that you essentially don't give up your right to life, even if you commit the most heinous of crimes. And so part of the reason why the police negotiate in this case and in others is because they actually don't want the hostage taker to lose their life. They don't want the hostages to lose their life, and that's a much bigger consideration. But part of it is also that they don't want the hostage taker to lose their life. Very few people are purely evil, just as very few people are purely good. And even hostage takers, we tend as a society to want to see the best in people and think that they are capable of redemption. And so we don't go willy-nilly shooting people, especially for crimes such as hostage taking, which in of itself is less serious than murder. And if we don't have capital punishment for murder, it seems hypocritical to basically murder somebody for hostage taking. Now, that said, the other reason why we do negotiate is because the majority of hostage-taking situations are resolved peacefully with no loss of life. So they don't happen all that often, and they certainly don't get the same attention because, as this one did, because this one blended issues of jihad and Al-Qaeda and Islam in with it. But hostage-taking situations do happen with some regularity across Australia, and the vast majority of them are resolved peacefully with no loss of life across the board. So the perpetrators don't lose their lives, and neither do the hostages. And on the face of it, there was no good reason to suspect that this hostage-taking situation was necessarily going to be any different. Now, you might say, because he had an Islamic flag and presumably was somehow related to some kind of jihad movement or ISIS, that this was a different case. But the problem with that is that we don't actually have any good data on that. As far as I'm aware, this is the first hostage taking of this kind perpetrated by somebody under the sort of ISIS banner, if you like. outside of the Middle East. And the Middle Eastern hostage takings where people are beheaded are quite a different thing entirely. Here we had a siege. It was a deliberately planned siege. The hostage taker had no plan for escape at the end of it, say. It wasn't done by a militant group, as they are in the Middle East, who have control over an organisation, over a territory or a region in which the hostage taking takes place. It didn't seem to have been planned that there would be a beheading at the end of it. It wasn't a group of people. So on the face of it, we don't actually have experience with these kind of hostage takings. So the only reference that we have for determining what would be the most likely outcome is other hostage takings that are similar to this, all of which lack the ISIS quality. And those ones, by and large, resolved quite peacefully. The longer it lasts, the better chances there are that people come out alive, the better chances that negotiation by the police are going to work. And therefore, it wasn't an unreasonable expectation that this was going to turn out okay, and that there wasn't a need to take a preemptive killing of this person. The other thing that this misses out, which a lot of people have pointed out, is that it's not as simple as a sniper just taking a shot. As well trained and as professional as an expert these people are, there's always the possibility of things going wrong. And when the police take the choice to shoot first, they also take on board all of the consequences that come with that. Now, we know that in the aftermath of this siege, that a number of people were shot. 2 people died, one of them almost certainly by the hostage taker, because he died before the police had even gone in. Another person was shot and died. It's not clear at this point whether that was done by the hostage taker. The suggestion is that it probably wasn't. And so, at least 2 or 3 other people were injured by the police bullets. We're pretty sure. Now, all of this will come out later once there's been a thorough investigation. But it seems like it's quite possible that only one person died as a result of the hostage taker. One person died as a result of the storming of the thing. And so it's quite a reasonable decision not to do this. Now, the police also had concerns that he might have had a bomb strapped to him, and that these are usually attached to a dead man's switch, so that if the person is killed, that the bomb will go off. They also had other concerns that there might have been other terrorists in there, that some of the people, the clientele at the cafe, might have actually been in on it with the terrorist. Apparently this is a thing that can happen in these situations, I'm not sure. And so they had concerns that simply shooting the guy, even if they could be sure that they would shoot him and that there would be no ricocheting of the bullet, there would be no other collateral damage, which is a fairly big risk to take. They were also concerned that there might have been other repercussions. All in all, they followed what is basically standard procedure in these situations that works well and has been shown to work very well. Familiar scenario, 17th of December 2014. A man, well known to police as dangerous and unstable, out on bail for being an accessory to the murder of his wife and sexually assaulting women. When is the court system going to start looking after the public first and not these blights on society? Have we learnt nothing from the Jill Maher experience? Maybe people who release these types of defendants should be held responsible for the actions of the accused on bail. I wonder how many people who pose a serious risk to the public would be released then. Gary Oldham, PR Waters. By that logic, we should simply not offer bail. The problem with this is that bail is part of our presumption of innocence. Until you have been convicted, you are presumed to be innocent, and therefore there's an expectation that you will not be unnecessarily detained. So even though this person had been charged with a number of offences, was still entitled to the legal presumption of innocence. We also know that bail works exceedingly well. It's very expensive to lock people up, and it also harms their defence. So it is unjust to lock people up unnecessarily. Now, the real question isn't whether we should release people on bail. Everybody agrees. Everybody agrees that some people should be allowed out on bail as a principle, that we should have some kind of bail, that lots of offences are not particularly serious, lots of offenders or people who've been charged and don't pose a risk to society. So the real debate is about whether this person in particular should have met the criteria, or whether the criteria should be tougher or not. And I suspect that a lot of people have thought about this, and it is a complex issue, and I would suspect there's been volumes and volumes of legal opinion written on exactly this. I'm not saying we shouldn't tighten up the rules, but it would seem to me that there are literally thousands of people out on bail, many of whom would be as dangerous as this person, who then don't commit offences, and that it is generally better for society that happens, that, generally our legal system is based on the principle that it is better for guilty people to go free than it is for innocent people to be locked up. And I suspect that this, these balance of bail is somewhere on that thing. Now, the other thing about this is that the charges he was, the things he was charged with was being an accessory before and after the fact to the murder of his wife. So the allegation is that his current partner murdered, I think, that's the allegation, murdered his ex-wife, and that he knew that she was going to do it, and he knew about it afterwards, not that he was actively involved. The other charges were a whole bunch of sexual assault charges dating back to somewhere between like 2000 to 2004. The court probably would have taken the opinion that those offences did not make him necessarily a danger to the wider community, on the basis that unless you happen to be his ex-wife, the murder of his ex-wife is unlikely to be an indicator that he was going to murder anybody else. And the sexually assaulting women ceased over 10 years ago, as far as we can tell. He had a spiritual guidance practice of some kind of psychic healing thing, and he sexually assaulted a number of women who came to him for some kind of spiritual guidance. But as far as I'm aware from the meagre facts that have come out in the media, that seemed to have stopped back in 2004 or so. And so for 10 years, it looks like he wasn't victimising the public. And so to conclude based on that he wasn't, they have no reason to suspect that he would be an imminent risk to society, was probably a pretty good one. The other offence that he was convicted over, and which his High Court challenging of, that had just been denied, seemed to be the trigger for this. So the other offence that he was involved in was writing letters to the families of dead soldiers who died in the war in Afghanistan, essentially saying that they died because they were doing the wrong thing, it was against God's will, or some such like this. And he was found guilty of basically harassing these families. Westboro Baptist Church type stuff, but through the mail. None of these crimes would suggest that he was going to be an imminent danger to the public. I don't think you could conclude that just because he happened to then go on and commit this crime, that this should have been foreseeable by the judges granting bail. Next up, sent back home, 17th of December 2014. The government should have deported Manharon Monis back to Iran a few years ago when he sent revolting letters to the families of deceased soldiers. M. Sims Balajura. So, this guy was a refugee from Iran. He came to Australia in 1996. In seeking asylum, he was granted refugee status, etc., and integrated into society to some extent. In 2006, he started sending these letters to the families of dead soldiers. So for 10 years, he'd been in Australia, and as far as we knew at that point, because the sexual assault allegations had not been reported to police, there'd been no hint of this. So as far as we knew at that point, he'd been a law-abiding citizen up until then. And so there was no question of, whether he should be deported, whether this would invalidate his refugee claims. The other thing is that even if he had turned out to be, even if we did know that he was a criminal at that point, being a criminal doesn't invalidate your refugee claim. If you are at risk of persecution in your homeland for no good reason, regardless of what your conduct is like subsequently, you still have a genuine right to refugee status, to be protected from the persecution that you would face in your homeland. And I don't see, you might argue that the screening procedures were poor back in 1996, you might argue something along those lines, but one of the fundamental blocks in our, as a international community in refugee policy is the idea that people should never be returned to face the threat of persecution back home. If once they're found to be a refugee, they are a refugee. And once we'd accepted him to Australia and granted him Australian citizenship, he was an Australian. There should be no issue about trying to deport Australians to other countries. Once you grant him citizenship, he's an Australian, he's our problem. And yes, things should have been done about that, and he was. He was found guilty of the crime, and in the judge's opinion, it wasn't a very serious crime. It certainly wasn't one that was worthy of deportation. He was given 300 hours of community service. That was the extent of criminality that they saw in that crime. And the High Court was split 3-3 on whether or not it should even have been a conviction. There are genuine legal issues there about whether actually what he was doing should have just fallen under the banner of free speech. Anyway, lastly for this week, Protecting a Nation, 17th of December 2014. The Sydney siege is evidence we must know who we are letting into this country. An open door policy is wrong, and the security of our nation and its people must be a priority before anyone or anything else. M. Nardi Bibra Lake. There were many letters along this line, and the suggestion is always that because he was a refugee and asylum seeker, he sought asylum here, granted refugee status, and then he subsequently went on to do this horrible terrorist act, that somehow we should have seen that happening almost 20, the potential for this almost 20 years ago when he was seeking refugee status here. One, that's frankly absurd. It's not like there's any suggestion that he had any terrorist leanings at all before that. He only seems to be writing letters to dead soldiers' families in sort of 2006, after he'd already done a range of other things, including sexually assaulting one of those women. There's suggestions that part of the reason he had to leave Iran is because he had embezzled $200,000 of clients' money. It would seem, and he had an ex-wife murdered more recently, it would seem that the best fit for this guy is one of a criminal. That doesn't invalidate, as I said in the previous answer, any claims of persecution or refugee status. And certainly doesn't say that we need to keep refugees and asylum seekers out of this country. To say that, he committed this crime and he was a refugee, therefore refugees commit these kind of crimes. It makes as much sense to say that he was a man and he committed this crime. Most crimes are committed by men. Does that mean that we should somehow keep men out of our society because men tend to commit most violent crimes? Absolutely not. That's stupid. The other suggestion that was floating around was that he was mentally ill and that we should see his acts in terms of mental illness. The same thing is true. Mentally ill people, the research shows, are actually more likely to be victims of violence than to be perpetrators of violence. Of course, the same can be said for his religious beliefs. He did it under the banner of Islam. But he makes a strange kind of jihadi. Firstly, he didn't actually have an ISIS flag. One of his main demands that the media were ignoring was to have an ISIS flag delivered to the cafe. He had a generic flag that had the, I think it's called the Shadar, which is the Islamic statement of faith, essentially. There is only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, or whatever. And that is not an ISIS flag. That is a generic Islamic flag which is used for peaceful and jihadi purposes. It's exactly the same thing that's on the Saudi national flag. So he wanted an ISIS flag to be delivered to him because he didn't have one, which suggests that he was less than thoroughly involved in ISIS. The other thing that was interesting was it was only weeks before this that he'd converted to Sunni Islam, I think, from Shia Islam. As an Iranian, most Iranian people are Shia and are essentially, these are the mortal enemies of ISIS. ISIS hate these people. They're seen as being heretics. So up until a couple of weeks before this, he was a Shia Muslim. If particularly religious at all. We have no real evidence that he was anything more than some kind of attention seeker who was using these kind of issues for his, personal gain. Apparently he converted to a couple of weeks beforehand to Sunni Islam, and suddenly he's identifying himself as some kind of jihadi. The other thing is that there's every suggestion that he had no intention, necessarily, of killing anybody. Now, I don't say that that's definitely the case, but I'm saying that we don't actually have very strong evidence that his intention was actually to kill anybody in this siege. Multiple hostages escaped without him killing anyone. He didn't kill any of his hostages in retaliation for any of the escapes, despite having more than a dozen hostages. It's not like there was any overwhelming reason why he needed to keep them all alive, necessarily. He kept threatening to kill people, which is true, but then so do most hostage takers. And it would seem, based on the facts that have been released so far, is that it's quite possible that the only reason he killed the person he did that triggered the end of the siege was because that person tried to wrestle the gun off him. And there's not necessarily clear evidence that even in that shooting that he intended to kill that person. Now, I'm not excusing this by any stretch of the imagination. As soon as you walk into the cafe with a gun, and as soon as you start taking hostages, then the responsibility for all of those deaths and injuries ultimately falls on him. I'm not trying to excuse that, but what I am suggesting is that it's quite possible that in his mind, his plan was to stage some kind of siege to get media and public attention, and that his plan didn't necessarily involve the killing of hostages. And so on the basis of all of this, it's hard to see how our system for allowing untold hundreds of thousands of refugees into this country over the last 20 years that has resulted in one siege like this, when these kind of sieges happen with some regularity by people for non-religious motivations. It's hard to think that our asylum seeker policy is somehow fundamentally flawed and is endangering lives in Australia any more than any other random policy. Anyway, that's it for this week. Good to finally get all that out. There was a lot of rubbish floating around in the newspapers and in the media this week, but there was a lot of good things. I'll Ride With You was a great hashtag. And in fact, actually, the way that people generally responded to the siege has been somewhat heartening. That's it for me. I hope you're all doing well. Coming up soon is Christmas, so next week I'm sure we'll have a Christmas-themed one. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, whatever you celebrate, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.